Dr. Sula Windgassen, thank you so much for making time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for your patience in me getting here.
It's funny because I often say that it's taken a while to get from initial contact to recording, but this is probably
Yeah, the longest. I really appreciate your patience.
no. I'm just so happy to have you on board. Um, for people who might not be familiar with you or your work, I thought it might be helpful to just maybe unpack what is a health psychologist and how did you end up working in that field?
Yeah. So a health psychologist is someone who specializes in using psychology to improve health. But as you can imagine, it's like a broad field really because it can be any kind of psychology and any kind of health outcome. So there's the more, I would say, behavioral health psychology, which is focusing on lifestyle factors and how we can help people utilize psychology so that they can make healthy behavior change, essentially, so that they can stop smoking, they can do more exercise, they can take the medications that they need to take when they're prescribed it for a health condition. So there's that end of the spectrum of health psychology. And then there's health psychology, which is what I think more as clinical health psychology, which is more about looking at how we can use evidence-based psychotherapy and psychological models to help people experience chronic illness better, and for some chronic illness that might be reducing physical symptoms, even getting people into remission. And for some chronic illness, it might be more around generating acceptance and ways to have a fuller quality of life so that the illness doesn't completely take over. So it's a real broad field. And I think one thing that is useful for people to know is health psychology training in the UK at least doesn't require people to have psychotherapy training or training to work clinically. So people can do a purely research-based health psychology doctoral qualification and come out the other end accredited with the HCPC, but they're not necessarily accredited to provide psychotherapy. And so what I did when I was doing my health psychology doctoral training and my PhD, which both was more research based, my doctoral qualification was more kind of working with people psychotherapeutically, but I knew that I needed more training because it just wasn't sufficient. And the bits of training had been like what I'd been able to source, with limited budget as a student. So I then went on to do training as a cognitive behavioral therapist as well. So my kind of way of working with people has been built on a CBT framework, and a lot of the research that I was doing was, assessing cognitive behavioral therapy in the context of chronic illness. But as years have gone on, I've integrated, more approaches. I got trained in what's called eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, so EMDR for short. And yeah, and from the outset, my route into health psychology was more from my own experience of mindfulness. So I've always, had various different integrations, but it's been a long path.
There's so much there, and for listeners, I don't want to feel like I'm just glossing over all of that experience, and there's so many aspects to it. One question that just came to me was because you have such experience with different elements of kind of therapeutic or healing modalities work, I wondered, have you had a point where you realized, like, oh, 4 years ago, this was at the forefront of my mind in terms of a person's healing. And actually, since I've cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, oh, I've actually shifted a little bit here, shifted a little bit here. Has there been like a development that you can kind of track?
Yes, definitely. Not in perhaps in terms of like what I've been focusing on for people's outcomes, because that's always so patient led, but more in terms of I suppose my understanding of what's been going on for them from a biopsychosocial level. So I still think cognitive behavioral therapy is a really excellent framework because it helps us understand how our thoughts, our emotions, and how we respond interact with what's going on with us physically. And that really explains a lot from, experiences of depression when you feel so low, or anhedonics that you can't get out of bed. On a physiological level, that's going to influence our thoughts, but our thoughts are also going to influence that. So I think that framework still wonderful. But the model of CBT is, focused predominantly on let's try and shift the behaviors so that we get different experiences, which again, from my lens, on a physiological level, starts to shift things so that we can start feeling different, we can start thinking differently, and then that, has a positive knock-on effect. As I've done more training, and particularly the turning point, I think, well, maybe not a turning point, but the bit that really crystallized the shift in my approach was when I did EMDR training. Because EMDR, it's a funny modality. It still feels so kind of magical almost, but it's got such an incredible evidence base. And the idea behind EMDR is that you're using what's called bilateral stimulation to stimulate processes in the brain to help people connect with really distressing things that have happened in a way that's not so totally distressing, and it helps the brain to update so that they're they're no longer kind of as affected by whatever went before. And that can look really different for different people. So for people with PTSD, that's like helping the brain realize you're not still in that car crash that was 10 years ago. And once it gets that chance to update in this way, the exaggerated response to the car speeding up slightly reduces, and the kind of automatic anticipation of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to get on transport reduces. So it was really quite astounding to see how that changes things for people. And a big part of that, because the mechanisms of EMDR still we don't really know. We're in our infancy with the research. What the trainers kind of talked about is this model of adaptive information processing. So how the brain's able to pull in all the different elements of what was going on, from like how we were thinking about it, how we were feeling, etc., how we were physically feeling as well as emotionally. And when I, have gone on my deep dives into the research to like understand that from the different modalities that I was already using, and my understanding of how the body works, and what we do in kind of helping people reduce pain, for example, that was what was really fascinating to me, to see that our brain basically isn't getting the opportunity to process really difficult emotions. And at the outset of my journey into therapy, I probably would have really underestimated the importance of that element, perhaps ignorantly, and perhaps I would have been quite dismissive about that element because it was so close to psychodynamic therapy, which again, I think there's great psychodynamic therapy now, but when I was at the beginning of my journey, it was very much influenced by my experiences of psychodynamic therapy, which wasn't great. So now I think my practice has very much evolved to take the processing of emotions a bit more front and center, and really acknowledging the importance of that alongside shifting behaviors and thought processes.
Thanks for that, Sula. There were so many threads there that I wanted to pick up on. I really like that idea of like EMDR, giving the brain an opportunity to update. And for people, I think, who struggle with anxiety or who are struggling with a chronic illness that are listening, they understand that. But I also think maybe someone who maybe doesn't struggle with anxiety and doesn't have a chronic illness, they might go, "What do you mean update my brain? Like I'm living day to day." But
Yeah.
even I was playing football yesterday, and immediately I kind of returned back to this 16-year-old person who plays football, because I remember when I played football when I was 16, and that there's this the part of us that can so easily sink into a younger self,
Mhm.
given a particular situation that we're in, or even the feeling that we remember, that we
Yeah.
associate with our childhood, or that our younger selves.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think about it, you're quite right. Brain updating is not necessarily an intuitive concept, but to draw on what you were talking about there, we all experience different modes of ourself, if you like, in present day mode. So like there's Sula at work versus, Sula when she's with her dog on the couch. And that switching into that mode for most of us isn't a conscious process. Our brains already assimilated the context, the emotional feelings, the expectations, etc., etc. So, just being in that context on the couch with my dog versus, in some kind of office or with my clients changes how my brain's processing. And that's what's happening for all of us in all different contexts. And then if we think about how those modes manifest in our day to day, well, those modes have been happening historically from, age zero. So then it makes sense that they inform what happens to us in the present, right? So like a good example of this is if live away from home and you haven't seen your parents for a while, and then for whatever reason you have to live back in the same house with them, and then you just notice the defaulting back even to like a kind of moody or more irritable version of yourself, and and that's those kind of modes in action. Your brain has updated in lots of senses, but on some of the elements around that context there's still this kind of emotional representation that is kind of stuck in time.
And even on the parents' perspective, they might be looking at a 30-year-old adult, but they still
Absolutely.
treat you. Okay, that's very helpful, Sula. Thank you. Um, I wanted to talk about people might associate health psychology or a health psychologist, they strictly work with people with a chronic illness. I want to get to that in a little bit, but I also just want to unpack a little bit what you might do with people who are struggling with a chronic illness. Obviously, you did fantastic work with my girlfriend who was struggling with a chronic UTI issue, but unfortunately, it's quite common,
Mhm.
and I'd love for this to kind of serve as a bit of inspiration for people who might be struggling, and just to kind of for you to walk a little bit about what you can do and how there are many ways in approaching this
Mm.
holistically.
Yeah, so I approach working with health from a biopsychosocial perspective or framework. So what that means, that word is broken down into bio for biological, psycho for psychological, social for social slash environmental. So what we're really looking at is health from that prism. If you imagine three spheres overlapping each other, so that in the middle is the impact of all three of them, that's what's going on with our health, right? So we can't have a health experience without having a psychological experience, because our day to day is deeply psychological. Our decision to go here for lunch or to stay here for everything is informed by our psychology. So and the reason that I stress that is because I think sometimes people automatically associate psychology with just mental health, but mental health is one part of a much broader psychology. And why that's so important in chronic illness is, yes, our mental health can be affected and likely is affected by the experience of physical health issues. But when I'm working with people with chronic illness, I'm not trying to fit them into a model of mental health. So the model is not let's fix your mental health to fix your physical health. The model is let's look at how these processes of psychology, health, and the wider social experience are overlapping, so we can change what we can change or update what we can update with the effect of improved psychological and physical health outcomes where possible. And what that looks like for people is very different depending on what people come to me for. So for example, people with irritable bowel syndrome, we've got a really well evidence-based protocol, which is a gut directed CBT protocol, which can help people, first of all, understand what's going on in their bowels. Second of all, work out what we then need to change in order to help the bowel re-regulate. And then, more broadly understanding the role of how specific worried thoughts, for example, if I get a bout of bowel issues here, it's going to be really bad and blah blah blah, and then that's going to trigger more bowel issues. So we work with all of that stuff, which is uh, I think of it again as this kind of stepping stone approach. We do one bit, and then another bit builds on it, and another bit builds on it. That approach, it looks one way for people with IBS, looks a different way for people with inflammatory bowel disease, and a different way for people with chronic UTI. And even within those patient populations, there's a lot of variability because, I think that therapy really needs to be individualized in order to be effective. Some people that I see with, let's say, pelvic conditions, past trauma plays a big role. and we have to do some trauma processing. For other people, it doesn't play a big role, but there's a role of just being traumatized by the symptoms itself. And so we'll work with that, but we'll more be working on how to essentially help the brain and body feel safer around having these bladder symptoms so that the brain bladder connection can become less reactive. So it's really hard to describe in a nutshell, but broadly speaking, we start with an assessment to understand what probably are the main features that are feeding into the health presentation. And then we start with trying to get um, updates to the foundations that are necessary for the body to start feeling safer, if you like. And usually that, involves some kind of um, somatic approach, where I'm kind of helping people experience whatever's going on physically in a slightly less reactive way, which in itself is quite a difficult thing to do. But when people start to notice that they can be with particular areas of their body with neutrality, then we want to say, can you be with the difficult area with a bit more neutrality? But that's going to be an ongoing process throughout therapy. And then we're interested in the things that get in the way of that, the reactive thoughts, the emotions that come up, and then we might decide which part to go off on. To should we work with the thoughts, should we work with the emotions? But a big part of that often is the history of what's gone on. So if there is really strong emotion, often it is people being brought back to trauma around the symptoms, whether that's medical trauma or the time where they were really stuck with these symptoms and it felt like they were never going to go away and they were so trapped because of it. So then we might do a bit more processing, but all of the therapy is around whoever has come to see me, what their goals are. And some people are like, I want these symptoms to go. And then we'll be working very closely with these mind body processes and the interaction between them. And some people are like, I know that there's a limited scope for these symptoms to go. For example, people with endometriosis, to some degree, there's going to be pain, but I would like to reduce the degree and how debilitating, and I would like to accept, what's difficult because of this condition so that I don't feel so like I've left an old life behind. And so that will look very different, that kind of therapy.
Now, your beautiful, articulate answer has been unfortunately butchered in many ways, and two kind of, sorry, not you personally, but this kind of message, right? This
Right, yeah.
nuanced message around the biopsychosocial model. Um, and I want to get back to your answer in terms of there's two things that I'm really like angry about that I see really often online, but which is like one, people could hear what you're saying and kind of say it's nearly all in your head, right? That's
Hmm.
one. And two, it's like all individualistic, but the social model, we'll talk about that after. And I bring this up because I remember when I was speaking to my girlfriend initially before she saw you, and she would get very frustrated at this idea that the way you speak about something in terms of can I be with a sensation neutrally?
Mm.
Can I notice how I might very quickly to go to, oh well, here's my day is ruined and this is never going to get better because it's informed by the past and it happened several times in the past or numerous times in the past. And someone can hear that and say, oh, it's all in your head. And I
Mm.
remember when my girlfriend heard that, she got so furious because she's like, well, clearly it's not in my head because I feel it in my body. But then she
Hmm.
came across you and you managed to give her these tools, but also explain it in such a way to say that there's a relationship.
Mm.
Undoubtedly, there's a relationship between mind and body, but it's not all in your head. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people with chronic illness do hear that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought this up because the message "it's all in your head" is such a damaging one, uh, on many levels, right? And I think part of it is what the repercussions of the message are. So if someone's being told it's all in your head, it means, well, you're on your own to deal with this because no one believes you. It also means it's kind of your fault because you're not doing enough. It's all your responsibility, and your head, your remit. Just sort out how you're thinking, and then lastly, you can't trust your own experience because you're feeling something that is really actually all in your head, but it's very physical. So all three of those elements are so damaging on a physiological level, which is the irony of it. So to be told you're on your own and this is all your fault, it violates one of our core safety needs, to feel like you're going to have support, and that whatever endeavor you've got to make something better or improve a situation, there's going to be people that are there to help you, whether that be healthcare professionals, partners, family, that kind of get where you are, and to have that core need violated when you're at your most vulnerable is really distressing, and it's distressing psychologically, but it's also distressing on that physiological level because our body is wired up to sense threat in particular experiences, and that being one of the key ones of like, oh, you're vulnerable and you're on your own. You'd be a goner back in caveman days, let's say. And really, that's not how our caveman societies even ran. We were quite collective, and we did look after our vulnerable people. But so it would be inherently threatening for that to happen. Then if you add to the mix the element of you can't trust your own experience, again, another core safety need violated, because you're like, if I can't trust my own reality, what do I have? I've got no stability here, and I can't make any right moves because I'm probably making the wrong one. So you're really kind of penned into a place of disempowerment by that message. And it's one that I see again, and it's rhetorics like mind over matter, or it's all trauma, or it's all because of emotional repression. None of these things are outright wrong, because there is a role of these things, but they're wrong in the sense that they're reducing physical health down to purely psychological. And yeah, the two are intertwined, but one is not causing the other. So I can get butterflies in my stomach, which is a physiological event, not because of my own thoughts or necessarily psychology. I can have a thought right away of like, oh gosh, that means something bad's going to happen, which is psychological. But then my physiology is going to react, and perhaps my stomach gets involved, my heart rate's faster, and that is a physically distressing thing that's very real, related to the thought that I had, but it was already brewing for whatever other reason. These things can get triggered by lots of different things that aren't psychological, but then I'm in this psychobiological loop. And so the reason that we're working with psychology is because it's a direct line to our physiology, and that's one of the only ways often that we can influence our physiology if we're not taking loads of medications or doing something drastic. Of course, we can work a bit more directly with physiology through exercise and other things, which is part of what we can integrate into therapy. But even then, that's kind of psychological, because if I think exercise is going to make it worse, then I'm not going to do that. So this is why it's so fundamental, but this is also why it's not as simple as psychology causes health issues.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sula. It was a necessary clarification for anyone,
Yeah.
because I'm sure people listening have heard this. People say it offhand. Um, Moving just a little bit towards this social aspect of health. I know that you've talked significantly about the research in terms of one, the importance of being heard, which you've kind of touched upon, which again isn't just an individual, this feeling of being supported, but also in extension to that, the quality of your relationships and that impact on your own
Mm.
health. I wonder if you could speak a little bit around that.
Yeah. I mean, we live in a world um, that is kind of increasingly individualistic. If you just think about, how our expectations are for what our life should be like, for lots of people, there's a general consensus that We, go through school, get whatever we can in order to hook onto a job that's going to sustain us and maybe our family silo if we end up having a family. And then what we're working towards is like all of these markers to ensure the safety of our little family silo. And, that's an all right idea, but when that's the focus, often what falls by the wayside is these broader connections that are important. And we see it in places that are more urban. Um, we also see it in places that are rural as well, but where the cost of living is high. You've only got so much time. You've got to pour a lot of that into getting money to, ensure the survival of your little silo, whether you've got kids or you're in a partnership or what have you. And then you don't have that much time left or capacity left for other, even, pleasurable solo things, but also, maintaining friendships. And then when people come to have children, let's say, there's a reason that that can have such a big knock-on effect on people's mental health and sense of self, and they go through crises because, again, we're not meant to raise children just two people or one person. It's meant to be like they say it takes a village. That's what it used to be like. So the way that we're living now is very different to many ways that we were set up physiologically, and that has an impact. It has an impact just on the very basics of, like, if you think about sleep when you have a child and everyone's like, it's the worst thing. But that never would have had so much of an impact because there'd be this kind of interdependence on the team, so that you could catch up on sleep. And so what ends up happening is we feel like we're the problem. And, again, it taps into that sense of being alone and being faulty, which violates these kind of core principles of feeling safe on that psychological and physical level. And then when that happens, it can be an unraveling because you get these thoughts about how you're not good enough, it's your fault, no one's there. And all of the research out there shows just how important it is to have a sense of being valued and being socially connected. It's one of the biggest buffers against the negative physical effects of stress. And yet, if we don't have it, we're not only vulnerable to the negative effects of stress, but more likely to experience them. So it's a real fundamental, but it's a real difficult one because, and I often, I'm exploring this tricky balance with clients of like, if your social circle is eroded, because of the experience of physical illness, let's say, if people have been like, it's all in your head, you're not trying hard enough, and they really haven't been able to show up for you or even understand your experience and you feel abandoned, when you're still dealing with these physical experiences, it's hard for you to tap into that social circle because it's inherently hostile. And so there you are, vulnerable because of these health experiences. And we're like, we need to get you some social experiences that feel safe, but the onus is on you to try and find them because there's not really ready-made places for that to happen, anymore. So it's a tricky process. It's a really worthwhile one, and important, but yeah, it's hard because you're at your most depleted and we're trying to find you a safe space, and inherently things are going to feel more unsafe because of how you're feeling. So yeah, it's a hard process.
Yeah. And that's why I get very frustrated when there are people talking about health but don't talk about the need to change structural issues in society that
Yeah.
facilitate so much of this kind of stuff that you're talking about. Um, I want to spend a bit of time around grief with chronic illness and like difficult emotions with chronic illness. And to start off, I wanted to know because I've seen this in my own life, and I wonder, have you seen this as well? Where because um, having a chronic illness is so overwhelming, and you can get to stages of feeling like despairing, not knowing if it's ever going to change, like you said, abandoned, isolated, not heard. I wonder, have you seen in response to this difficulty that that a person almost takes with like such good intentions, an incredibly individualistic route to hopefully feeling better, because it has to be they can't allow the control to be outside of them, because that means that it's not guaranteed. And I don't know if I'm making this clear. So, like, say for instance, I have a chronic illness, and it's like really broken me for potentially decades, but maybe years. And because the possibility that the answer requires other people, and a kind of, not reliance, but this understanding that there's this interconnection, that that it's going to take time, that it's not this like one answer,
Hmm.
because that's so scary that I have to work with several different things.
Hmm.
I'm more likely to go down this route of, and you see it so often online, of, do this diet for 40 days and you'll clear all inflammation. Do
Hmm.
this course with me and I'll clear all your negative thoughts and I'll rise
Yeah.
your vibration. And I wonder, have you seen that? Because that's worrying for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, if I was just writing about this recently, it's difficult, right? Because on one hand, trust is eroded, that you will get the help that you need, especially now in England, the NHS, we're seeing the increase in waiting times and, ridiculous waiting times for some sorts of things. I think I read like it was like the average of 80 days or something for a gynecological appointment. Like, and that's a secondary care appointment, so people have already been probably back and forth to the primary care. So like when you go through the realities of yeah, present day, I guess, and you do get disappointed or let down or your needs aren't met, it's almost inevitable that you're like, well, I have to take this into my own hands. I can't wait around for 80 days. I need to find answers. I need to, whatever I can do to get private appointments a bit quicker, or to, whatever else it might be, find alternative things, do this course. And on one hand, there's a real benefit to it because people, go out and research and find what they need. And, lots of people that have worked with me wouldn't have done so if it weren't for their own research. Not that I was the the utopia there, but they had obviously gone through lots of different elements to find things that they needed to do, and they kind of collated it all, and that helped them kind of improve their situation. If they don't, they're kind of trapped. So on one hand, it's really important. On the other hand, like you say, this sense of disempowerment, lack of control it's inherently threatening, and it's kind of preyed upon in the wellness industry. One coach that I follow, I think she talks about it being like a $54 trillion industry, the wellness industry these days. And there's no qualifications that people need to enter the wellness industry. Someone can have their own experience of symptoms, cured themselves, gotten better, whatever you want to call it. And then they're like, oh, well, I did these things, so these things must work for everybody. Um, let me talk about my own experience, which is really compelling content. People are like, oh my God, that's exactly how I feel. And look, now she's got this glossy hair and what have you. Um, so on that real kind of emotional level, which is really what drives a lot of our behavior, all sorts of behavior, including kind of consuming behavior. We're compelled by these things that aren't really backed by very much. Um, and you know, it, let's say the course wasn't even that much, and there was a little bit of benefit to it. It still potentially does quite a lot of harm, because what's been sold is, here's the answer to all your problems, and what's been received is like the reality of like, okay, this helped a little bit, but it's not what I thought. And where the threatened brain goes and the kind of vulnerable mind goes is, well, that's because either I didn't try hard enough or nothing's going to work for me. This helped so many people and it didn't help me because of how these messages are framed. And that is what does a lot of harm. You know, people get really, really hopeless and then they're like, well, I just need to try harder. And there is a real phenomenon of people burning out in their on their healing journeys, you know, burning out to heal. I've had people tell me, you know, I've taken this year out and this is my year to heal, and you know, I'm doing this diet and I'm doing this and I'm doing this, and I'm like, whoa, that might not be the right approach. That's a lot, and that's a lot of pressure on you. And when you're getting these symptom flares, they were bad enough to begin with, but now you're getting them, and your brain's telling you you're getting them, even though you're doing all of these things. But yeah, it's like trying to being in a busy kitchen and having all the pans on high heat. It's almost impossible to make a good meal.
I like that metaphor. Yeah. And I guess for people listening that either like know people in their lives who might fall into that category, or they themselves, they think, oh wow, like I did spend X amount of money on a course because I was pulled by this person's charisma and the fact
Mm.
that they had similar symptoms to me, and you know, it hasn't, I still have these issues, and some of them might be structural, relational, and then some of them might be individual. So I wonder, how do you help people with that kind of grieving process, those difficult emotions that are inevitable with a chronic condition?
I mean, it starts really with acknowledgement, you know, of that it is really hard. And I think we struggle as humans just to give people that acknowledgement and space. It hurts us to see people that we love or care about in pain, and so we automatically go to try and fix it. But in doing so, that reduces the space that they've got to feel what they're feeling. Um, and almost feel like they're not able to, and that yeah, that's not so helpful. So I think, you know, one of the first things, and probably one of the biggest reasons people come to work with me, is because I'm not always talking about the fixes. Oh, you got this, here's your hack. You got this, here's your, you know, do this. 10 reasons to blah 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 blah. It's about what you're going through is actually really difficult, and here's why it's really difficult. Um so the answer is really not simple, and if you've been feeling like it's not simple, you're quite right. But that doesn't mean that there's no hope. It just means it's going to take a bit of time, and if we can cultivate a way of you being with yourself during that grieving process, processing process, and healing process, then you know that's going to stand you in good stead long after this kind of crisis period or this difficult period. Um, yeah, but the journey is a little bit rough, and I think being realistic about that, there's going to be successes that you see early on, but you know it's also going to be painful, and there's going to be difficult elements, and there's going to be things you can't do straight away. That's the nature of, you know, learning any skill. Even, you know, you don't just go fluent, become fluent in Spanish when you start doing Duolingo. You're like, oh, I know all of this, and you're like, why couldn't I make that conversation work? I've done this, because your brain has to catch up and it needs repetition and what have you. So, um, I suppose a big thing is around giving people space to tell their story and really acknowledging elements. And what I'm always kind of surprised about somehow is um, how the degree of minimization that people have in their own experience. They'll tell me something, you know, deadpan, and I'm like, wow, that sounds awful. And they're like, well, yeah, but it wasn't as bad as this, you know, awful thing that happened to them. I'm like, yeah, but that was still really rough. And I think one thing that I've seen when doing, say, EMDR processing, for example, the people for whom processing takes a little bit longer on a particular memory are the people who've got this really ingrained sense of like, you don't deserve to feel bad about this. It's not bad enough. Um, because then we have these kind of parts that get in the way of like, why are you even doing this? You're wasting her time. She must think you're so pathetic. You are pathetic, you know, or whatever the process is. This isn't really a thing, and that narrative or sentiment gets in the way of being able to acknowledge and experience and process the emotion, which is what we need to do. So yeah, it's kind of helping people acknowledge their own thing through doing it yourself, and through making, if a client, for example, comes into a session and they're really distressed and they're like, that, I'm distressed because X, Y, and Z has happened. What I try and make a conscious effort to do is be like, well, rather than go into what's happened and let's figure that out and talk about that, should we just spend a moment on being with the emotion and like feeling that for a minute and like having a safe space to do it? And that always is the right thing to do. Whenever I manage to do it, it's always the right thing to do because there's like a relief and like, oh God, yeah, I'm seen and I'm felt in my own emotional experience, not just by the therapist, me, but by oneself, and then we can tend to have more of a helpful exploration of whatever we need to
Mhm.
explore.
This this reminds me of I finished When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate last year, and towards the end he like referenced this like unbelievable piece of research that I just am like dumbfounded at how this isn't really everywhere. And the idea was about and it's a nice segue actually to the next question. um, that there's this, like you were saying, that there's a sense of a completion in the nervous system when we've allowed ourselves to feel our emotion.
Mm,
And he says that a lot of people who have issues with, for instance, either sadness or anger, um, let's say anger, for instance, their issue is either they will repress it, they don't want to talk, they don't want to allow the feeling to come up, or that actually when they feel anger, they dislike the feeling of anger so much that they'll do something like they'll punch something because that's a distraction from the feeling of just feel like being angry.
mm,
And that
mm,
if you can actually just say, right, I'm furious, I'm just letting this furious feeling in my body, that there's actually this sort of completion, and the nervous system goes, okay, that's great, we felt that and we can move on. Now
mm.
I bring this up because I feel like it kind of adds on to what you're saying, but also like you were talking about earlier, there's this it's all trauma, it's all in your head. Another big thing recently is it's all your nervous system. You just got to
Yeah,
regulate your nervous system. So I'm
yeah,
conscious of this, and it would be great if you could maybe explore that nuance, please.
yeah, yeah. I think this is the reason I've been off Instagram for a little while. I'm just it's such a hard place to be. I think when people are talking about this regulation of the nervous system, often what they're talking about is one sub branch of the nervous system, right? They're talking about the autonomic nervous system, which has two sub branches, which people talk about in terms of like counterbalancing each other, which they do to some degree, but that under emphasizes the fact that they also work together a lot of the time. So both can be active at the same time, and people don't seem to know that. And when that happens, so just for people who don't know about this kind of physiology, the autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that is kind of in control of our automatic processes so that we can react quickly in terms of things that we need to activate for. They might not necessarily be stressors, they might just be things that we need to do. Um, but also come back to a balance once we don't need to be activated anymore for stressful reasons or otherwise. And that's where this counterbalance rhetoric comes in of like the sympathetic nervous system activates for our fight or flight, the parasympathetic nervous system activates for our rest and digest. And so once the stress is over, the parasympathetic comes online so the sympathetic can go offline. And that does happen to some degree. But there's also lots of times during the day where both will be active to some degree as well. And there's coordination in between the both for things like even, having a wee, or, going to the toilet. So uh, why this becomes misleading is because people think then, well, the sympathetic nervous system reaction is bad, and the parasympathetic nervous system is good. And that's not true. We need both. If we have too much parasympathetic nervous system activation, um, that's not good either. We can't then activate and get the energy up that we need to like mobilize and do what we need to do. Um, but also, if we're aiming for that like perfect balance between sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system activity, um, it again feeds into what you were talking about with that personal responsibility bordering on micromanagement of our physiology. So like, oh my gosh, I've been activated. That feels terrible. This must be really bad because I've got cortisol now and I've got adrenaline and I've got this, that, and the other. So I need to, do my breath work, or I need to tap, or whatever the thing is to um, sort out their vagus nerve. And That's not helpful or healthy. It's actually much more destabilizing, I think, to the body to have to like always counterbalance like soon after. It's kind of the equivalent of like if you swear and then you're like, sorry, 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 I didn't mean that, you know? um, so what we really want is like flexibility in this autonomic nervous system. We just want uh, to be able to rely on it to come back to equilibrium. And yes, sometimes that does take a bit more extra effort to help our parasympathetic nervous system activate. But if we're focusing on things that what's talked about is improving vagal tone, which is like improving the vagus nerve's ability to activate the parasympathetic nervous system response. Things like breath work and things like maybe yoga or what have you, yeah, they're great. They've got their space, but it also, I guess, obscures the role of doing things that channel activation that then allow us to recalibrate naturally. So anger is a good example, right? Feeling angry, you don't then have to do breaths to get rid of anger. You just have to feel angry, and maybe, you can channel that anger by going for a run, or having a difficult conversation, or, whatever else the thing is that needs to tap into that high activation. Um, and then your body can automatically do the thing. But if we're micromanaging doing the thing, we're often kind of like missing out on the thing that would allow the body to do it for us naturally, which takes a bit more introspection, and it's not always one clear hack. And that's why I think this kind of content carries quite easily. It gives us that sense of control.
Appreciate that answer. Because you can get the assumption that, oh, I just need a calm nervous system all the time,
Yeah,
based off, kind of these short clips of people talking about it
yeah,
without talking about the nuances. And because this is another thing that I noticed more broadly, like for instance, I know nothing about cars, and I can go to the mechanic today, and he can say, "Listen, you got to fix this and you got to fix that, and that's going to be about 400 quid." And I'm not going to be able to tell him that he's wrong because I know nothing
yeah,
about cars. And I feel
yeah,
like a lot of this is how happening uh, in the health field, where it's like
yeah.
I know very little about the nervous system, and if you say some terms that sound quite
Mm,
scientific, and you reference a study, is by and large, I'm going, yeah, okay, that sounds like I
yeah.
can get on board with it, you know?
And research shows us that even if we're critical of our sources, and we so when we're exposed to misinformation, even if we know that that's misinformation and we're critical about the source, if it has an emotional impact on us,
Mm,
that's the thing that stays with us.
mm,
Um, and that gets compounded, that effect, right? So if I see a video by someone saying, this study shows that if you regulate your nervous system 3 times a day, your heart rate variability will be this amount, and another research study shows that getting your heart rate variability this amount means that X, Y, and Z, whatever, and that X, Y, and Z is what I want. Let's say um, means that you'll just feel calmer forever and you'll never get stressed again. Um, I mean, even that would be an overreach, but you're like, oh yeah, that doesn't see that, well, there's elements of that I could investigate, but it seems a bit of an overstatement to say that I'll never feel stressed again. Um, but that interest and that sense of like, oh, there's something there. Then if I see another video talking about the same study and it gives me a bit more detail and it taps into my need a bit more specifically, when you are, dealing with highly intense situations, you'll feel grounded in your body and blah blah blah, and they put it in a really beautiful way. I'm like, that would be really nice. And that does, your brain's not even kind of cognitively, consciously necessarily putting the two together. It's just going on under the surface. By the seventh video, I'm like, oh wow, I really need to do that exercise. That what? Sharon's got a course for 50 quid. Why not? So even when we're critical of this kind of information, or we know that it's not true, it's the emotional thing that really drives us, and research is really quite clear about that effect happening.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking that the algorithm backs that, right? So like
Mm,
it would be great if you had an algorithm that's, oh, actually if we appeal to people's emotions with, information that's not necessarily legitimate or scientifically backed, um, but if it
yeah,
appeals to their emotions, they might jump on board with it. But instead
yeah,
we have an algorithm that goes, oh, they watched that, give them a bit more of that, give them a bit
yeah,
more of that, and then they're paying for the $2,000 course or, you
absolutely.
know.
Which is why we're in a funny spot at the moment because we're consuming social media with a high level of health content on social media. So essentially, we're kind of consuming public health messages all of the time, but public health messages disseminated by unqualified people, but more persuasively than public health messages are themselves. So now, this is a really weird time to be alive where, people are like, no, I don't trust that my doctor said, it's okay to do this because I've seen all of this saying this and doctors aren't up to date now and blah, 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 blah. And of course that is true sometimes, but also not always. But it's hard for our brain to find that nuance.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Um, and I wonder, has your mind ever gone to a place where I wonder what we could do to increase the amount of actually healthy, legitimate information around health and wellness? And like, has your mind ever gone, I wonder if we could just make an algorithm that actually pushes this instead of that? Or I wonder what we could do to stop all of these people with like millions of followers, your
Mm.
Jay Shetty's and your whatever, just talking about these things and because I like Jay Shetty, he's a good looking guy and he makes me laugh every week, all of a sudden he has this person on. Maybe he's right. And because I've been thinking about this. Sorry, I might go a little spiel. I've been thinking about this where because podcasts are so influential now, and like
Mm.
the podcast and social media are so interrelated, that you get to a point where because so you get to a point where you're relatively attached to the podcast host or the influencer or the person on Instagram, whatever, and that you don't realize because of that attachment, you're not able to make distinctions like you might not if the attachment wasn't there.
Yeah.
And because also the podcasts don't start with, hey, I might mention this green protein for $50 in the podcast, but I'm doing it because they're paying me loads of money.
Yeah.
Because they don't say that flat out, there are people who will just unconsciously go, well, I like this guy. He
Mm.
seems really healthy, and he keeps on talking about these green protein things, so I might buy them. Yeah, I wonder, has your mind ever gone like, well, what can we do?
Well, at the podcast level, what I what blew my mind is like the really big podcasts, like say Huberman Lab and things like that. Even Diary of a CEO, they don't have independent fact checkers. I think maybe that's changed now because the Diary of a CEO got a bit of scrutiny. Um, but in the for example, I listen to a true crime podcast,
Hmm.
and they go through a rigorous process. They've got fact checkers to make sure that they're not, speculating too much or, being disrespectful or what have you. That's for a true crime podcast, and of course important, but arguably much more important in the context of health, right? If someone comes on and says you need to monitor your glucose spikes, otherwise you're going to get dementia. Of course, that should be checked, and when you check it, it doesn't take that much to see that it's based on absolutely nothing. So, um, that's one thing that I think when you get a podcast past a certain level, making a certain income, that is obviously influential off those bases, they should have to have independent fact checking, because it does so much damage when they don't. And that can then hopefully mean that there are these disclaimers, or it are kind of phrases that have to be used to kind of help people's brains switch in a little bit more to be a bit more discerning. So I do think that's one level, and I also think on another level that, and people have been saying this for years, but there needs to be some kind of regulation on social media, um, especially with the advent of AI, because it just means that people can spew out all sorts of things much quicker than ever, um, and make it even more compelling. And so we're going to be so inundated with, I mean, we already are, but even more so with, so many conflicting things, that then there needs to be some level of, um, I don't know what it is, but policy really at the top, so that it can't just be this free for all that it currently is, because it really does so much damage. I work with people who are like, Sula, I know what you're saying is true. You've sent me the research papers. We've been through X, Y, and Z, and I understand it. The problem is, part of me just doesn't believe it, because I've seen this thing on social media so many times, which makes me think what you're suggesting is really dangerous. I'm like, yeah, and that's not your fault. That's just, your, again, kind of physiological processing of this, like, threat. So I need to really, be careful and not disregard that message. And that's all of us really, but so something needs to happen from the top, I think.
Agreed. Agreed. I just have two more questions for you. So,
Sure.
this has been very enjoyable. Um, sorry, and very quickly, if for people, I feel like if you're listening to a podcast and two people are talking and the presenter just pretty much unanimously agrees with everything that the other person is saying, um, and the other thing is like, and this is like, for instance, like I had a podcast previously, like two podcasts, and I said that I wanted to disagree with him, and then we wanted to do the podcast because we wanted to disagree with each other and show that you can disagree with each other and still treat each other
Hmm.
humanely. But I feel like people don't realize that the kind of the unstated fact is, if a big podcast person has someone on their podcast, they're not going to challenge them. They're
Mm,
basically
mm.
there to go, here, like, give me that good story about this and give me this and
Yes.
that. I'm not here to go back and forth. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that, like, I feel like that also should be like a disclaimer, like, hey, we're actually friends. And not only
Yes.
like the friends that can disagree with each other, we're like like kind of business partner friends. And if he
Mm.
comes on my podcast, I do well, and if I go on his podcast, we do. So we're not really in the market for disagreeing with each other and calling each other out on each other's bullshit, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
sorry, and then the final question, because I know you've talked and worked around this idea of mental imagery, and I wanted
Mm.
to end on this because it's another area that can get
Yeah.
like hijacked by a certain demographic or percentage of the wellness industry, about like, you just gotta imagine that you're healthy and everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not true, but it's also, there is some degree of benefit to mental imagery, and I'd love if you could just end on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of interesting research around mental imagery for all sorts of things, from in the corporate world to seeing if you, mentally rehearse like what you're going to do, how does that impact on your ability to do that thing? And so, everything from like test performance to getting your chores done. Research has showed that if you use mental imagery beforehand, it, has quite a significant impact on you kind of meeting that thing afterwards. And one of my favorite studies, I can send you the reference for your show notes. It's about, people who were in rehab, and trying to build up kind of muscle. And at this point, they didn't have really any kind of strength or muscle. And when they, compared people that use mental imagery, so they imagined picking up things, um, uh, versus the people that didn't use the mental imagery and they went through their usual rehab process as well. It was something like, I think it was 176% improvement in the mental imagery group. So really like quite profound. Um, and again, there's lots of reasons why mental imagery can be helpful. It's using our brain in a different way. It's changing then how we're feeling, which is changing our emotion, changing, the representations in our nervous system and broader bodily systems. And so, and all of, and it's kind of readying our body for something, so we're, yeah, more equipped. But again, there is other research if you kind of where mental imagery gets merged with more manifesty laws of attraction, want it enough and you'll get it. There is other research that shows people who believe in that and who manifest, when you look at like their outcomes on like finances and other things compared to people who don't manifest, there's no difference. But when when there was a study looking at specifically at kind of people engaging in manifesting versus those who didn't reach their goals better than those who manifested. And when they looked at why and they did all this measurement, it was because there was something about the belief in manifesting made people more passive so that they engaged less in the things that they needed to engage in. So I think, when we're thinking about imagery, utilize it and think about it as like a way of working with your emotions and your headspace to tool you up to then engage in the action that you need to engage in. And that's probably the best way to utilize it. But it's not this magic utopia of like you don't have to do anything else.
No, and I also feel that that's like a kind of a sneaky hijack of like the capitalistic market, where it's like if someone's unhappy about an injustice or something, but if we tell
Yeah.
them they just want to manifest a different reality, then they won't actually get involved in the grassroots projects that are necessary to eventually change that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. That and therefore it's your fault. If you're not where
yeah,
you want to be, it's your fault. You didn't want it enough, you didn't try hard enough, you didn't think about it enough,
yeah,
which is we know is untrue, There's lots of people wanting things way more acutely than us, that don't have it.
yeah. That's true. Listen, so this has been amazing. I really appreciate you
Thanks for
as a,
having me.
yeah, it's you're a special person in a difficult field, and I hope that people draw inspiration from this. And so I'll link your Mind Body Connect platform and your website, maybe your
Oh,
Instagram
great.
and show notes, and anything else. Yeah, if you wanted to send me any of those studies, I can just put them in the show notes as well.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'll dig that study out, the imagery one on muscle. Yeah.
Perfect. And just to close, Sula, what lesson is life teaching you right now?
Right now, life is teaching me. Um, I think it's a really lovely lesson about the empowerment and the kind of nourishment in embracing enough, yeah, again, in the societies that we live in, we tend to be pushed to do more, to expand, to grow in some way, shape, or form. And my word for this year was nourish, and the intention around that was just really um, lean into the things that are already here without as much emphasis on like doing more in the moment to get more in the future. In every sense, like success or um, more bedrooms or whatever. Uh, and that has so far. I mean, it's only end of January, but it's been a real, yeah, a lovely tether.
Lovely. I'm glad to hear. Well, thanks again, Sue. I really appreciate your time and I really appreciate your work, and I'm sure the listeners will too.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.